Hi and welcome to Innovators number 11. Behind every great man lies a great woman. A quote often heard but not strictly true in all senses. However, what can be said is that often throughout history, women and their achievements have often been overlooked or overshadowed by men. This is also the case within the music industry, and really it's only in the last 30 years contributions to the development of music culture made by women have been recognised. Even then, it does tend to be those most successful, like Madonna or Beyonce. We don't often realise how many women have made considerable contributions to the advancement of particularly electronic music, production techniques and genre development. Innovator number 11 certainly made her mark 50 years ago, but has only become recognised for her work in the last 10 to 20 years. One could imagine that every single person watching this video has been affected or influenced by her work. Probably one of the most recognisable electronic compositions ever written, and although a collaboration, her most famous work is known by millions of people. However, she is rarely credited. Largely ignored in life and barred from working in studios because she was a woman, Innovator number 11 was awarded a posthumous honorary PhD from Coventry University in November 2017. In a nutshell, with over 130 known compositions recorded and many others for television and film, 267 tapes of additional compositions were discovered after her death in her attic. Innovator number 11 certainly made major contributions to electronic music. Interviewed in 2000, she said, "I just have a passion to make abstract sounds, a deep-rooted physical passion." If you were to hear her most famous composition, one you would surely recognise, you would then know of Innovator number 11, Delia Derbyshire. Kendra Leonard in The Avid Listener has described composer Delia Derbyshire, probably one of the most influential composers of the 20th century, but most people, including professional musicians, have never heard of her. Delia Derbyshire was born in Coventry, England in 1937 and educated at Coventry Grammar School and Girton College, Cambridge, where she was awarded a degree in mathematics and music. In 1959, on approaching Decca Records, Delia was told that the company did not employ women in their recording studios, so she then went to work for the UN in Geneva before returning to London to work for music publishers Boosey and Hawkes. Interviewed by Pete Kember for Surface magazine in May 2000, Delia Derbyshire said, "After my degree I went to the careers office. I said I was interested in sound, music and acoustics, to which they recommended a career in either deaf aids or depth sounding. So I applied for a job at Decca Records. The boss was at Lord's watching cricket the day I had my appointment, but his deputy told me they didn't employ women in the recording studio." She then eventually joined the BBC as a trainee assistant studio manager in 1960, and in 1962 she transferred to the BBC Radiophonic Workshop in Maida Vale. The BBC Radiophonic Workshop was created in order to produce soundtracks for primarily radio programmes, and Derbyshire utilised both real-life and artificial electronic sounds in her compositions, using a musical style known as musique concrète. It was French composer Pierre Schaeffer who first coined the term during the 1940s, and musique concrète embodies the idea that concrete sounds from objects found in the real world can be used like jigsaw pieces to construct an entire composition. In 1963 she completed her most famous work, the realisation of the Doctor Who theme tune. It sounded completely different to anything that had gone before it, and proved a perfect way to usher in this strange new show with its enigmatic hero and monstrous, terrifying villains. An often repeated anecdote runs that Derbyshire played the finished piece of music to Ron Granger, who was the original composer, and he was so astonished by the sound that he is said to have asked, "Did I really write this?" Derbyshire nodded. "Most of it," she replied. When Ron Granger wrote the melody for the Doctor Who theme, he supplied only abstract direction. Interviewed in Bozine, Delia Derbyshire explained, on the score he'd written sweeps, swoops, beautiful words, wind cloud, wind bubble. So I got to work and put it together, and when Ron heard the results, oh, he was tickled pink. Her colleague Brian Hodgson later noted, it was a world without synthesizers, samplers and multi-track tape recorders. Delia, assisted by her engineer Dick Mills, had to create each sound from scratch. She used concrete sources and sine and square wave oscillators, tuning the results, filtering and treating, cutting so that the joins were seamless, combining sound on individual tape recorders, re-recording the results, and repeating the process over and over again. As stated by Helen Pidd in the Guardian newspaper in November 2017, due to BBC policies at the time, Granger, unwillingly, is still officially credited as the sole writer. Interviewed for Red Bull Music Academy in September 2013, Pete Kember, aka Sonic Boom from Spaceman 3, Spectrum and Experimental Audio Research, argued she felt she was very poorly treated by the BBC, who denied her a credit on the Doctor Who theme, even though composer Ron Granger wanted to share it with her. While her male colleagues at the BBC received money every time the TARDIS door sound goes. However, 1964 ushered in what began and is still referred to as the golden age of the radiophonic workshop. Initially set up as a service department for radio drama, it had always been run by someone with a drama background. Derbyshire was the first person there with any higher music qualifications, but as she wasn't supposed to be doing any music, much of her early work remained anonymous, under the umbrella credit as Special Sound by BBC Radiophonic Workshop. In its early days, the equipment at the Radiophonic Workshop was minimal, and Delia would utilise any found object that took her fancy that might be able to generate interesting sound textures. They'd accrued quite a collection of noise-making paraphernalia such as bells, bottles, stringed things, clocks, copper hot water cylinders, and even a broken upright piano, and this was actually used for the TARDIS dematerialisation sound. And these objects could generate interesting whooshes, clanks, whirs, and other sounds heard on dramas or documentary soundtracks. One of her most cherished found sounds was that of an old industrial metal lampshade, which produced a bell-like chime when tapped. When interviewed, she said, "My most beautiful sound at the time was a tatty green BBC lampshade. It was the wrong colour, but it had a beautiful ringing sound to it. I hit the lampshade, recorded that, faded it up into the ringing part without the percussive start. I analysed the sound into all of its partials and frequencies, and took the 12 strongest and reconstructed the sound on the workshop's famous 12 oscillators to give it a whooshing sound." Kendra Leonard explains, her vast library of work displays her sense of imagination and playful approach to sound, including tapes of her saying her own name and running it backwards at various speeds, sounds made on found objects like metal lampshades, ashtrays and tools, and electronic devices from the arcane, oscillators, to the mundane, blender motors. She worked with pre-recorded sound as well, using World War II air raid sirens to represent fear and uncertainty, and monastic chant as something calm and intangibly peaceful. Along with natural sound sources, Delia would utilise old electronic test equipment that the workshop had inherited from other departments in the BBC. For example, signal oscillators on which she played the swoopy sounding melody line on the Doctor Who theme by manually adjusting the frequency control knob. Reference marks would be made on the instrument panel around the frequency dial with a chinograph pencil to indicate the appropriate notes in a scale, and then she would use white noise generators, and these can be heard in the Doctor Who theme as sinister swishes and swirls. The Radiophonic Workshop also possessed a Bruel Kajar Type 1022 beat frequency oscillator, a device originally designed for electrical and electroacoustical measurements and acoustic research, but was also capable of generating interesting wobbly sine waves at frequencies from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. At this time in the early 1960s, synthesizers didn't really exist, and so vacuum tube sine wave and noise generators were the workshop's only source of electronically synthesized sounds. But the radiophonic workshop could do a lot with very little. An article in the Guardian newspaper from May 1970 stated that Delia is composer and technician in one. Before long, the workshop's TV output had overtaken work produced specifically for radio, and Delia Derbyshire was called upon to do music for drama and documentary programmes set in the distant past, the unseen future, or deep into the human psyche. In fact, any area where an orchestra would be out of place. She also wrote for science, arts and educational programmes. In the same interview in 1970, Delia explained that people seem to think I'm just working with funny noises, that it isn't quite serious or something. I think a lot of people have a sort of block about electronic music. They think it must sound frightening and oppressive. When she was told at the workshop that her music was too lascivious for 11-year-olds and too sophisticated for the BBC Two audience, Delia found other fields where the directors were less inhibited, such as film, theatre, happenings and original electronic music events, as well as pop music and avant-garde psychedelia. A recent Guardian article called her the unsung heroine of British electronic music, probably because of the way her infectious enthusiasm subtly cross-pollinated the minds of many creative people. Over her time working at the BBC, she had exploratory encounters with Paul McCartney, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, George Martin, Pink Floyd, Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, Anthony Newley, Ringo Starr, and Harry Nilsson. As Mark Brend describes in his book The Sound of Tomorrow, sometime in 1966, Paul McCartney knocked on a door of a house in Putney in South London, where he met Peter Zinoviev, Brian Hodgson and Delia Derbyshire, working away from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, writing and recording under the name Unit Delta Plus. They weren't a traditional group or band, but a short-lived group dedicated to the promotion and creation of electronic music. Leading McCartney down the garden towards a large shed, Zinoviev showed him into, as described by Mark Brent, the best-equipped electronic music studio in the country. The room was packed full of tape recorders, audio oscillators, mixers, and, uniquely for a recording studio in Britain at the time, computers. This was a marker in the development of pop and rock music when artists such as the Beatles embraced the avant-garde and incorporated it into their own musical styles. Without people like Derbyshire meeting all of these important musicians in all fields, it's likely that these developments would not have occurred as and when they did, leading us to where we are today musically. When Unit Delta Plus performed at the Watermill Theatre near Newbury on the 10th of September 1966, the programme notes state, "The studio of Unit Delta Plus has specialised in electronic switching arrangements to reduce the manipulation, editing and copying of tape, and also in the development of controlled randomness in certain aspects of sound." Unfortunately, the music they composed wasn't particularly well received and had a limited audience, and they split in 1967. However, the bulk of Derbyshire's work was still for the BBC, and ever-decreasing deadlines for effects, soundscapes and music meant that in 1973 she quit the BBC. Interviewed in Bozine, Derbyshire stated, "Something serious happened around 72, 73, 74. The world went out of tune with itself, and the BBC went out of tune with itself. I think probably when they had an accountant as Director General. I didn't like the music business." As stated by Mark Brend, her temperament, her thoroughness and attention to detail, her enthusiasm and unwillingness to compromise creatively gave her the mental resources to produce great work, but also exhausted her. By the mid-1970s, Derbyshire was disillusioned by the apparent future of electronic music and withdrew from it, preferring to work in a bookshop, an art gallery and then a museum. In the mid-1990s, she returned to composition, however many of her works were never heard publicly. Helen Pidd in The Guardian states, "But despite her talent and credit from her peers, Delia failed to gain widespread recognition during her lifetime, eventually becoming disillusioned with the industry." Delia Derbyshire passed away in Northampton, England on July 3, 2001. In 2017, in her birthplace of Coventry, Delia Derbyshire at 80, a festival celebrating what would have been her 80th birthday, was held for recognition of her work. Delia Derbyshire has the accolade of Innovator number 11 for the following reasons. The breadth of her compositional work from television and radio themes, incidental music and soundscapes is extraordinary. Alongside her work outside of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, her work in Unit Delta Plus, also commissions she received, heralded the birth of modern electronic music. Rejecting traditional Western music writing methods, she was utilising mathematical principles in her writing. Derbyshire's musical style is, in most cases, notably more abstract than those of her workshop contemporaries, and by this measure her technique and understanding of the technical dimensions of sound and composition are rather more mature, sharing artistic traits with people like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. In the liner notes of the 1969 album BBC Radiophonic Music, describing Derbyshire, it states, "She often decides to attach more importance to the musical quality of the individual sound than to the musical argument, which is usually kept simple or even non-existent. She prefers to use an analytical approach and to synthesize complex sounds using electronic sources. She finds that this throws valuable light on the nature of sound and the way we hear and interpret it." Delia's works from the 1960s and 70s continue to be heard on radio and TV some 30 years later, and her music has given her legendary status with releases in Sweden and Japan. She's also constantly mentioned, credited and covered by bands from Add N to X and Sonic Boom to the Aphex Twin and Chemical Brothers. Mark Ayres, a composer and sound designer at the Radiophonic Workshop, said, "Any composer of my generation with an interest in electronic sound and music cannot fail to have been influenced by Delia's talent." Clive Blackburn, Derbyshire's partner of the last 21 years of her life, said, "Delia would be really excited by the developments in electronic music. Digital technology is finally catching up with what she managed to achieve manually in the 1960s using the most rudimentary of equipment." Thanks for watching. See you next time.